Coming to you from the Forge of Freedom studio in the heart of America. A podcast dedicated to preserving freedom and inspiring personal success. Freedom is born and lives through you, the individual, and it dies in the shadows of tyranny. Motivating our listeners to become well-rounded, freedom-minded people with the body of an athlete, the mind of a stoic, and the spirit of a warrior. The tree of liberty lives on through you, the Forge of Freedom. And now here's your host, Alex Ooley.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Forge of Freedom podcast. I'm your host, Alex Ooley, and this is episode 27 of the Forge of Freedom. Today, I have a special guest on the show, former prosecutor and current Judge Dustin Houchin. For those of you who don't know Judge Houchin, he is the judge for the Washington County Superior Court here in Indiana, and he was elected to the bench in November of 2022. Prior to his election, Judge Houchin was the county prosecutor for Washington County, a position which he held since 2006. And before that, he operated his own firm, Houchin Law Office, here in Salem, Indiana, and supplemented his practice with work as a criminal defense attorney. Judge Houchin earned a bachelor's degree in political science from Indiana University, and he also completed his law degree at Indiana University McKinney School of Law. Judge Houchin is a resident of Salem, Indiana, along with his wife, Erin Houchin. They have 3 children together, and Erin is currently serving as a representative for the United States House of Representatives. Welcome to the show, Judge Houchin.
Well, thank you, Alex. I appreciate that. The lengthy and kind introduction there, but It's nice to be on.
Yeah. Well, I think it's fair to say that you bring a lot of personal experience to the subject we're covering today, crime and punishment, and specifically the retributive theory of justice. With your work as a criminal defense attorney and then as a prosecutor and now as a judge, that's something that you certainly deal with on a regular basis. In fact, it's a topic that both of us deal with me as a criminal defense attorney and you now as a judge. We deal with it often, at least week to week, if not day to day.
Yeah, frequently on the exact same cases, right? You and I.
Yeah, exactly. But this is a topic, obviously this podcast is geared toward freedom and creating a freer life for yourself and a freer world. And theories of crime and punishment are important and have a big impact on creating a freer world. And there are often disparate views on how we should achieve that, how we should treat crime, how people should be punished or not punished, should they be rehabilitated, and we're going to get into that today. I think primarily coming from, or at least arguing for the retributive model over more of a rehabilitative model. So, like I said, I think it's important to have substantive discussions. I don't think that you and I even agree on everything in this subject or necessarily, but I think there's lots of overlap probably. But I think there are arguments that people need to understand because so often when you hear about these subjects in the news, it's so polarized, like so many topics we talk about and hear about. But I always think about this quote from Thomas Jefferson. He says, a well-informed citizenry is the best defense against tyranny. And I think you would agree with that as well, wouldn't you?
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah. All right. So with that said, let's get into the topic for today. I guess first off, I'll give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about what is retributive justice and how does it compare to other rationales for the criminal justice system?
Yeah. Well, thanks for the opportunity, Alex. You mentioned I started my career in criminal defense, elected prosecutor, did that for 16 years. While I was doing that, I was very active with the state legislature working on criminal policy. My wife was a state senator for a good chunk of that time, and I got the good fortune of working with her on policies in this legislature. And then now as a judge, so I see this from many different sides. I've spent a lot of time thinking about what is the proper role of the government in punishing wrongdoing, what are the proper parameters on that. Of course, lots of really smart people have thought about this, and so breaks down into some categories, and one of those categories is retributive justice, or retribution, as it's frequently called. And it's pretty simple in concept, but of course, simple things when you dig into get more complicated, right? So the basic concept is a wrongdoer, someone who commits a crime, should be punished solely because they committed the crime. And then a second part of that is that the punishment ought to be in proportion to the harm that they caused. So that sounds really simple, and on the surface it is. I think it gets, if you ask 100 people on the street, should you be punished because you committed the crime, you probably get 100% agreement, right? But then when you contrast retribution with some of the other models that are out there, I think that's where the disagreements or the different opinions start to come in. So I may take a minute and contrast with a couple of other broad theories of criminal punishment.
Yeah, I think that's good because, I mean, we don't have the system of criminal justice that we have is not purely retributive. It's not purely rehabilitative. It's not purely, restorative. There are lots of different sort of overlapping concepts in our current system of criminal justice. So I think it'd be good to talk about some of those other rationales.
Yeah, and I don't advocate for a pure retributive model. My position is where there's a choice, we should tilt toward retribution. But the way I view it, and you may have some more specific thoughts, the way I view it, there are two other broad categories of rationale for punishment in criminal cases. One being deterrence, so that the reason the government, the state would have authority to step in to punish a criminal wrongdoer would be to create deterrence, most specifically to that person, deterring them from committing future crimes, but also deterrence for the society at large, for anybody who may be thinking about committing crimes, sees someone else punished and decides not to follow their behavior. And so deterrence is a theory. And the other broad category and a lot of things fit under this, I would call rehabilitative model, which is the rationale of the state stepping in to take people's freedom or to intervene in people's lives after they've committed a crime, is that the state has a duty to rehabilitate that person. And there are lots of different tools that the state may have to rehabilitate, a lot of other subcategories there. But to me, the three broad categories are retribution, deterrence, and rehabilitation.
So with retribution, I mean, we're focused primarily on the person who committed the crime, but it's not just about them, right? I mean, because it seems harsh. Maybe it seems like, well, where does the victim play into this? Whether it's the individual or society. But with retribution, the punishment isn't just about the person who committed the crime, right? I mean, there's some sort of moral justice to the concept, right?
Yes, I believe so. And so with retribution, there may in fact be a deterrent effect from retribution. Retribution is applying a punishment, right? Solely because the person committed the crime, not with the goal of deterring, not with the goal of rehabilitating, but you committed the crime, therefore there's this punishment. There may be second order effects of deterring future behavior. There may be second order effects of that person rehabilitates, but that's not the goal of retributive punishment. So I think it's important to note that the goal really is to condemn the behavior and demonstrate that society or the group has decided that this is not the kind of conduct we will tolerate, therefore it deserves a punishment.
It kind of, I think a lot of people may think of the common saying, an eye for an eye, and you talked about proportionality, and that's kind of encompassed in that saying. Is it the same thing as the eye for an eye concept, or is it a little? Can you distinguish it in some way?
I think the motivation for eye for an eye is the same motivation for retribution. So the feeling, the innate human feeling that inspires that statement also inspires the desire for retributive justice, right? So I think it's the same, but even the most serious retributive model would not poke someone's eye out, right? So we have what's important and unique, I think, about retribution is the punishment is conceived prior to the crime occurring, and so you try to, as best you can, decide what the harms are and what's a fitting punishment, and then in the future, when a person commits that crime, that's the punishment that's applied, versus how much rehabilitation does it take for this individual, and then we just rehabilitate until they're rehabilitated with no real end point on that. Retribution, ideally, and when applied properly, would have a price tag on the crime that's considered before the crime even occurs.
Right. And here we're still kind of contrasting the retributive model with the rehabilitative model. Can you say, I guess, why, in your mind, in a system that has components of both, maybe why on balance you think we should lean more toward the retributive side of things?
Yeah. So, and this sort of gets to your previous question. I think that the retributive model fits best with human evolutionary development. So, I've mentioned a couple books. I think you're going to put those in the notes, right? So there's a couple books that are influential to me on this. And one is Will Storr's book called The Status Game, where he talks about that we live in we're a tribal species, and we form in groups, and we try to gain status within those groups. 12 Rules for Life by Jordan Peterson talks about this a little bit as well, that humans organize in hierarchical relationships, and then we try to increase our status within those hierarchies. And that's a status drive. It's a drive similar to the hunger drive in humans. It's a drive that compels us. And the reason we try to increase status is because the higher status you are, the better access you have to good shelter, good food, good mates, good partners, resources, which means we're more likely then to be healthy and propagate good genes and carry on our gene line, right? So it's an innate human drive. And I think the retributive model harnesses that, it recognizes that exists. And when a criminal wrongdoer batters someone, for instance, commits a crime of battery, hits someone, they've not only done a physical harm to their victim, they've also extracted a status injury to that victim. So the criminal is effectively at that point dominant over the victim and is putting them in a lower status position. So, and retribution recognizes that status harm, not just the physical harm or financial harm that you may suffer as a crime victim, but the harm that you suffer as a member of the community, having a lower status, being injured.
Sorry to interrupt. I was just going to say, I'll certainly link to the books that you've mentioned and to a few other resources that I'll give you an opportunity to talk about toward the end of the show. And I'll try to link to anything you mentioned during the show as well. But you recently published an article on your Substack about this, right? About this sort of status, about looking at the retribution model from this human evolutionary status perspective. And it basically, they're saying, and I think you've said this too, I'm just trying to sort of recapture the meaning here that you've already stated, that the perpetrator, the criminal, is basically saying your life is less important than mine, and by committing this act of violence against you, I am saying that I'm more important than you are, and I'm shoving you down the status spectrum. Is that fair? Okay.
Yes, I think it's a good way to say it. And I appreciate, these aren't intuitive necessarily concepts. I think once you understand them, it makes sense. And I think you put that frame on the world, and status has a lot to do with how we interact as humans. But it doesn't come easily. It takes some thought to get to. So yeah, we should talk about this and try to flesh it out. But not only that you're knocking that on a one-to-one basis, the perpetrator is knocking down the victim's status, but also at the same time sort of exalting their own status within the community, that the they don't believe the rules apply to them, or if they get away with it, the rules don't apply, and therefore they have a higher proportion of the status of the community if it's not pointed out and demonstrated to be wrong, right? So
yeah. And I think, and I'll certainly link to this article specifically that you wrote for your Substack in the show notes, but you talked a little bit too about this idea of punching back in the society that we live in anyway here in the United States, that it's the state often that's the one doing the punching back on behalf of the one who's been victimized. You want to say a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think everyone would recognize there's an instinct as a human. If you get punched, there's an instinct to punch back, right? Almost all of us would have that instinct. Not that everyone would do it. They might consider the pros and cons, but that instinct is there, and I think that's innate, and I think that's because as victims, we want to settle the score immediately. We don't want to suffer that status injury any longer than we have to, because lower status is very detrimental to people. And we know that that's part of our DNA, right? So you want to settle the score immediately. Now, that's not a great model for criminal justice, right? We don't want people going around just settling scores vigilante style. So we have evolved as a society this third-party punishment model where the state will punch back, if you will, on behalf of the victim. That way it's safe and controlled and proportionate and fair. So the punching back is a symbol. Punching back on the state is a symbol of the value of the status of the victim, and it's a status injury then to the perpetrator, lowering their status on behalf of the victim. And then there's more to that I think we can talk about in a minute, but that immediate part sort of settles the score, if you will, brings the victim back up, recognizes their status, that they've been injured, and that the defendant or the wrongdoer deserves retribution for that.
Right. And that model, I suppose, of sort of outsourcing this punching back avoids one of the criticisms, right, of the eye for an eye concept. You've probably heard, I'm sure, and lots of people have, that if everybody took an eye for an eye, the whole world would be blind, right? Yeah, and right. So it takes away sort of that criticism to some degree anyway, because it's the state that's doing it on the for the benefit of the individual and presumably for society as well.
Yeah, and if you're in the throes of a status injury and a physical injury, and in the throes of that pain, what you believe is proportional is probably much greater than what you would believe is proportional if you took an objective view of what that punishment ought to be. So I think we recognize it would be harmful to society for people for that raw emotion to be the measuring device for what's proportionate, which is the retributive model. With this third-party punishment is more calm about it, more objective about it, democratic, in the best circumstances. So,
yeah, and I think you and I would agree on this, and a lot of the listeners of this show would agree that the government has expanded in far too many arenas in our life and is far too powerful and does far too many things to control what we do day to day. But part of the foundational beliefs in government, if people believe in government, is that it's supposed to protect our rights, and that's most importantly our right in our own body. So to some degree, that's the highest order operation of government, right? Is to protect our property interests, our interest in our own body, and then by extension our other property rights. So this retributive model, I think, takes that into account. And we didn't talk about this beforehand at all, but do you want to say a little bit about that? Am I right there? Do you agree with that?
I do. I think it is the prime function of government to protect. Where you go back to Thomas Hobbes with the social contract theory, right? Where we as citizens are giving over some of our autonomy to the government in a contract that the government will protect our property and our safety. And I think that's the primary function. And I agree with you that we've gotten far, far beyond that in many areas. But the criminal justice system protecting property and bodily autonomy is pretty fundamental to what the government should be doing.
Yeah. I guess I'd like to say a little bit about, or have you say a little bit about, and maybe contrast the retributive model with the rehabilitative model with respect to drug crimes in particular. You and I think, have differing views about what the law should be maybe in this arena, but part of the role of a judge, and maybe we can talk about this in a different episode, what the role of a judge is, but it's certainly not to create the law. It's to interpret and help parties resolve disputes. But could you say a little bit about, with respect to drug crimes, how the retributive model is maybe better than the rehabilitative model?
Yeah, so that's a little bit, there's a lot there to it.
Yeah.
I'll start by saying the retributive model is more intuitive as it applies to victim crimes, right? So this idea of punching back is, we all can sort of understand that and feel.
Yeah, with your example of the batterer, right? Somebody who's committing battery, it's easy in that situation. I think intuitively people agree that the person who batters someone else should be punished in return.
Yeah.
Right.
So then there's a question in drug crimes about whether, the argument that they're victimless, or that it's really only hurting the person that's doing the drugs, and therefore there's nothing to be retributive about. You don't have this injury. So I try to take that apart a little bit. I have another piece on this retributive theory coming out on Substack at some point. I'm working, so it's part of this idea that we're still working through, and it's not, they're certainly subject to criticism, but my argument is multiple parts. First, there is a tremendous harm from drug use. I would argue that it's not victimless. So the people around the drug abuser are certainly victimized, whether that's directly or not. And society as a whole is damaged because of drug use. And nearly every legislative body in the world has decided that drugs are bad and should be punished, right? So obviously our communities recognize the damage caused by drug abuse. So to apply retribution to criminal, the first question is, do you even criminalize drug abuse or not? I would say yes. Some people don't. Criminalizing it and then applying punishment through retribution, I believe, first of all, like I said in the beginning about retribution, signals the values of the community. It signals that the community condemns this behavior. Why does the community condemn that behavior? Because it's very detrimental to the productivity of the community. There's a lot of harm, a lot of unintended and second order consequences from it. So we get together in a legislative body, decide we condemn this, and the most effective show of that condemnation is a criminal punishment, okay? Which in itself probably leads to less drug use, although that's not the goal of retributive theory, right? So I believe the goal of retributive theory then is to, as it relates to drug crimes, is to create a status injury in the drug user, to create a differential in status between the productive citizen and the drug abuser. Now, there are lots of arguments in the rehabilitative model that we should remove the stigma, right, of drug use, that it should not be stigmatized. And my approach is the opposite. Like, it should be stigmatized. The stigma is a status injury, right? So it's just another word for a status injury. And I argue that because I believe that creating that status differential gives the wrongdoer an incentive to regain status in the society. If they suffer, just like the crime victim has an instinct to punch back to regain their status, if the state inflicts a status injury on a drug abuser, they have an incentive to regain status to the community. and then that punishment and suffering that punishment is a meaningful way to get back into the good graces of society. Society will recognize you did this bad thing, you suffered because of it, you overcame that, and now you're back in good standing. So I think the retributive model creates an incentive through that status injury, but also a path back to good standing by suffering meaningfully that punishment and doing some good with it. So that's the rough outlines of that.
Yeah. And I think and you pointed to this a little bit, but part of what I think is difficult for people to grasp when it comes to drug crimes, unlike the battery that we talked about earlier, is that with a battery, it's clear that the perpetrator hits or punches the victim, and it's clear who the victim is. It's clear who the perpetrator is. And with drug crimes, it's clear who the perpetrator is. It's the person either consuming or selling or dealing the drugs. But the victim is sort of this amorphous society. It's not a specific person. So this concept of punching back seems hard to grasp. There's no direct harm. It's mostly indirect. And I think that's where a lot of people struggle with the concept. Do you want to say a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's a legitimate criticism, and there are a few retorts to that I have. One is, if you don't criminalize, to the extent that you allow more free use of drugs, there will be more of a detrimental impact to society. Now, we can't measure that in any way. If we could, this would be a lot simpler, right? But
sure,
more drug use will cause more traffic accidents with injury and fatalities. It will cause more child abuse and neglect. It will cause more overdose deaths, more burglaries, more robberies. Left unchecked, those but you can't measure it. You can't put a number on it. But in addition to that, if not the retributive model, then what do we apply to it, right? And so the answer currently is rehabilitation. I've been doing this for nearly 20 years now, or over 20 years. And in my experience, we don't have very good tools for rehabilitation. Like, the real fact is, the medical interventions or the psychological interventions, the treatment programs just don't work very well on a very high percentage of time. So I think to criticize the retributive model, you also have to ask, compared to what, right? And so if we improved in technology and medical science and brain science to a point where we can consistently and effectively rehabilitate, then I think you got to take another look at which model is more successful. My point of view now is that the most effective tool we have is to harness that status drive that's innate in humans and use that to create incentives for the drug abuser to rehabilitate, to take the actions that he or she need to take to get back to good standing in society. I think that is more effective and more powerful than our current tools for rehabilitation.
Yeah, and I think, well, at least in my view, and I don't want to put views onto you here. So if you disagree, please tell me. But the state isn't good at much, and the rehabilitation is one of those things that it's not good at. And so I think that's part of the problem, right? Is that the state's not good at it, and no matter how much money you throw at it, it's probably not going to get much better. One thing the state is good at doing is punishing people. I mean, there are, numerous prisons. There are lots of ways to punish people, and local, obviously, county jails, at least here in Indiana. So the state can do that and does do that, but it doesn't rehabilitate people well. So whatever positive there may be to rehabilitation if it's done well, it's not done well, at least in your experience, I think, and in my experience, most of the time, it's not done well either. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, well, I would say it's not done well anywhere. Even under the best of circumstances, it doesn't work very often. It's especially not done well by the government, right? Like many things. And then another concern I have is I see, and I would expect that you see to some degree, not only is it not done well, you start to see incentives creep in to the rehabilitation to rehabilitate for the sake of the jobs of the rehabilitators or the grants that the rehabilitators are receiving, or to keep our programs alive or justify our existence at the expense then of the drug abuser that's in the program. And I said a lot of these programs, the goal of the program is to keep the program alive. It might start out with good intentions of our goal is to rehabilitate people, but then you hire some staff and their jobs depend on having warm bodies in their programs, and their grants depend on having numbers, and then it becomes we're just putting people in here to keep our programs alive. So I worry about the encroachment of the government onto people's liberty in the guise of doing good, right? Because they're
right.
I think C.S. Lewis says, there's a quote that I never can get right, but something about he'd rather be tyrannized by robber barons than do-gooders, because at least the robber barons will stop at some point, right? The do-gooders will never stop as long as they still feel good about what they're doing. So that makes me criticizing a lot of people that I work with and a lot of institutions that I work in. But I see it, and I believe that is a dangerous tendency of those programs.
Yeah. And I think I have the quote here that you're referring to in my notes. C.S. Lewis, he talks about the harsh tyranny that is levied by so-called humanitarians, in quotes, to inflict their reforms and cures on the populace. And he says, of all tyrannies, a tyranny exercised for the good of its victims may be the most oppressive. It may be better to live under robber barons than under omnipotent moral busybodies. The robber baron's cruelty may sometimes sleep, his cupidity may at some point be satiated, but those who torment us for our own good will torment us without end, for they do so with the approval of their own conscience. So I think that's the quote you were pointing to there.
Much more eloquent than I could say it, but yes.
Yeah, much more eloquent than I could say it for sure as well. But yeah, that I think that. No, go ahead. Sorry.
Wouldn't you agree, in your experience, like that is a real thing? That's not a theoretical statement by him. Like the system we work in, that happens.
Yeah, I don't know what context he was writing that in, but it certainly happens today. And as you were saying, there are these organizations that are sort of exist for the sake of their own existence, and live off of grants and funding for their own benefit, and not necessarily for the benefit of the person that they're trying to reform. But even if, and I think this goes back in our conversation a little bit earlier, even if they were effective at rehabilitating or reforming the person, is that really what the criminal justice system should be doing? I mean, because obviously there's this argument that we should try to rehabilitate people because maybe they won't commit crimes in the future, maybe they won't continue to use drugs, but it sort of ignores the victim if it's not a drug crime, the individual victim, that is. But it also, if it's society, I mean, society is also sort of receiving this double penalty. They're receiving the harm of the initial crime and then paying to reform the person through rehabilitation to go through these programs. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's part of why the rehabilitation model is dissatisfying to a lot of people. And I don't, people can't always put their finger on why, but I think you hit up on it is, and the reason why is it ignores the status injury, in my opinion. Like, I don't mean to keep coming back to this, but it's a fundamental rationale of this theory, and it's the drive for status is a deep-seated human drive. I would, as deeply seated as the sex drive, hunger drive. It's a primal desire of humans, and so that if we can harness that and satisfy that, then that feels right to people. And the rehabilitative model completely ignores the status injury. So I think you mentioned, we talked, or maybe when we emailed previously, about restitution a little bit. Is restitution, how does it fit in the retributive model? And if a criminal steals from somebody, and then the state comes in and says, you cost $1,000 damage to this person, you need to pay them back, and the criminal pays them back, which, as you know, is exceedingly rare, but let's say they do, you have satisfied that financial harm to the person, but you've not addressed in any way the status injury that they suffered. And I think it's the same way if there's a drug crime. Even if you successfully rehabilitate the person, you might have satisfied the injury or the future injury to society, but you didn't address in any way the status injury to the community, to the people around that person, and you did not inflict a status injury on the wrongdoer. Right? And instead, you conferred an exalted victim status on that person that was unearned by them, and therefore doesn't feel quite right to us when we look at it, I think. Whereas the retributive model would inflict a status injury and then say, if you're going to get back to society, you're going to have to suffer this punishment. I think rehabilitative proponents would argue that the treatment process is a suffering, or is a way to earn back your status, and that's true to some degree, but it's not the same as punishment, and it doesn't feel the same way to people. And I think that's what's going on there. It's my best theory about it.
Yeah, that makes sense. One thing I'd like you to say a little bit about. Obviously, we could do multiple episodes on the merits of the drug war, or at least laws against drug possession, drug use, etc. And I think everybody, most people anyway, would agree that drugs and drug use are harmful, not only to the person but to society, at least to some degree. And I guess, is there something in your mind, and we didn't talk about this beforehand, so if you'd rather save it for a different conversation, that's totally fine. Is there something that would distinguish drug use from other things people do that are harmful, that are not criminalized, like drinking soda or eating junk food, things that might lead to diabetes, which has a harm on an indirect harm to society? Is there something characteristic about drug crimes in particular that make them unique as opposed to those other sorts of activities?
I believe so, and I've thought about this a lot and talked about this a lot, and I think I have a good retort to that, or a good example. No one has ever prostituted their child for a cheeseburger, right? No one has ever gone to the McDonald's for a large Coke and left their child in the car for 4 hours while they did it, right? So it's, to me, there's similar, there's some similarity in kind, but the degree of harm that drug crimes inflict on society, or that drug use inflicts on society, is so much greater than even smoking cigarettes, or the food that leads to diabetes, or things like that. It's just so much greater. The depravity that people will go to, the damage that people inflict on their own children from drug use is so much worse in degree And I think that's why our society and our legislatures criminalize drug use, but don't criminalize sugar-filled soft drinks, right? Because it's just, nobody's going out robbing people's houses for Coca-Cola, right?
Yeah.
It's just not going to happen. So it's a matter of degree in my mind.
Okay. Well, that makes sense. And I think, like I said, we could have, I think, multiple episodes, at least one lengthy episode about this subject. And maybe we can do that at some point in the future. But I guess part of, and this is maybe an unknown, but part of the concern, at least from people, myself included, is that a lot of those things, the prostitution to buy drugs, examples like that, is that it stems from there being a black market for those products. There's not a black market for cheeseburgers. You can go and buy it, and it's safe. It's not healthy, but it's somewhat safe. So I think that is partly where, and we don't know what society would look like necessarily without the criminalization of drugs. So there's some of this unknown. I mean, you can look to certain places like Portugal and things like that, but there's not a clear vision of what society would look like without drug crimes, and whether those sorts of concerns would be allayed without the black market for those drugs.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. I think you're still talking about a massive difference in degree.
Okay.
Because of how powerful drugs are, particularly when now we're getting up into fentanyl, and even there are things more powerful than fentanyl starting to come out. So I would distinguish by degree, and then I would also distinguish in terms of I think ultimately you have to come back and say, we have a democracy, we have a legislature, they look around and have decided that drugs are of a different kind, right? So it's really a political question in my mind about how much of this should be criminalized. Certainly, there is a black market for drugs, and there's not for some of these other things. But I would say, as we have gotten far more lenient on drugs over time, the last decade, it's pretty easy to get drugs legally through doctors and clinics and things like that, and it hasn't. People don't go there. I always say you would arrest the person. We don't arrest people who are diabetic for insulin. Like, well, nobody's selling insulin on the street, right? They go to the doctor and get it. You can go to the doctor and get Suboxone, methadone, pain pills, and we still have this huge black market. So I don't know that would solve it. But point taken. Yeah.
It's a debate that should be had, and to your point, it's a political debate. And that's not the like we said earlier. And you've written actually a lot on this, the separation of powers, right? I mean, The judiciary is not the one that's deciding these issues. The prosecutors are not the ones necessarily deciding these issues. There's some talk about prosecutors that aren't enforcing the laws that are in place, but ultimately this is a political discussion that should be had by the legislatures of each state and the federal government. Is that fair?
Yeah, I agree. And the question they're answering, in my mind, is how much fallout from drug use are we willing as a community to tolerate? Right. You got to draw the line somewhere. If it's freer and more legal, more people are probably going to use it. That's going to cause some issues. Where do we draw the line? And there's no real answer to that. There's no correct answer, right? It's a political determination.
Yeah. Yep. So I'd like to talk a little bit about criticisms of retributive theory, and have you respond to a few of these. We've been talking a lot about the drug crimes, partly because the rehabilitative model comes up more in that context, right? I mean, people aren't, don't really think about rehabilitation when it comes to a murderer or a batterer, right? I mean, most people are on board with a retributive type of punishment for those sorts of crimes, and rehabilitation comes up more in the drug context, which is why we have dwelled on that for a bit. But I guess I think this probably comes back to your point about the moral status of the victim and also the status of the perpetrator. But when you punish someone, you're typically going to imprison them. And it's the taxpayers that are paying that cost. Could you say a little bit more about what you think the role of restitution is in that? Is restitution a form of retribution? Do you think it has any place in that, even where there's no monetary loss, like in theft, for instance? Do you think restitution should play a part in crimes like battery at all? It typically doesn't, but what are your thoughts on that?
I think it can. I would go back to, ideally in a retributive model, you sit down with, we have thousands of years of humans misbehaving, so we know most of the kinds of things people do wrong, right? And you can't game out every possible scenario, but we generally know what kind of crimes are going to exist. So in a good retributive system, you would sit down in advance, decide what these crimes are worth, for lack of a better word. What's a proportionate punishment, and I think part of that could be restitution. My concern is that restitution or making the victim whole has to include that status injury, which is harder to calculate. It's hard to put a number on, and it may be different for different people. More vulnerable people fall farther down the status hierarchy with injury. They're not as resilient, so the harms to particular victims are going to be different and hard to calculate. So I think restitution can be, but there are a couple practical problems with it being difficult to calculate, and then how many people actually ever have the capacity and the resources to pay restitution, right?
Right.
Most don't. So,
right. And I've heard this is actually an idea from Murray Rothbard, who's an Austrian economist. He talked about basically this idea of indentured servitude, where that the wrongdoer would work in a prison that produces things for profit, and that part of the profit would go to the victim, because part of the problem is that the perpetrator is suffering the consequence in terms of punishment by spending the time in DOC, but nothing is actually done for the victim other than the punishment itself. So I guess in your mind, should there be something above just the punishment? And I guess maybe that should be the primary concern, but is it that there are too many problems, or the state wouldn't be effective at doing it, at implementing some sort of system of restitution? Or is it that it's just that the punishment's good enough? And that's kind of a convoluted question, but
I think if I'm speaking as a retributivist, the punishment is the goal, right? Yeah. So if you're going to, I would say if you're putting someone in a prison, and we do some of this where there's prison work and that kind of thing, we don't direct the resources to the victim, which is potentially doable and not necessarily a bad idea. We have an unfortunate history in America of indentured servitude, which that starts to look like would be very difficult to implement. Yeah. So, there's a practical issue there. But what you're really doing in that scenario is that forced labor is a very low status position. So you're inflicting a status injury on the wrongdoer, which fits the retributive model squarely. So the question is, what do you do with the output from that? if you're going to have output, it makes sense to maybe direct some of that to the victim. Somebody's benefiting from it. Usually the inmates get paid a little bit, and probably the prison recoups some of their costs and that kind of thing. But I certainly wouldn't be opposed. I'd rather see the victims receive compensation than the state get more of the money and use it inefficiently, right? So I would not be opposed to directing it that way. Just I think there's some issues with creating a model that relies on that heavily.
Well, I mean, I think there are problems with the implementation. I like the idea and concept of restoring the victim, at least to some degree. But it would be hard to implement, especially in the current system that we have. I don't think our prisons are equipped to do that the way they currently exist. But the other problem too, and this goes back to an earlier point that you made about these companies or organizations that do rehabilitation, is that to some degree that criticism applies to state prison systems too, right? I mean, oftentimes their interests are not aligned with restoring the victim, and I think that would be problematic for that reason as well. The incentives aren't there in the system that we have.
Yeah, and I think there are. You've witnessed this. We've gone through in Indiana in the last 8 or 9 years some criminal code reform that pulled level 6 felons, the lowest level felonies, out of prisons into the local jail populations, which then caused a lot of locals to build new jails because they were filling up with low level felonies that they didn't used to have. Once it got to the point where the prison system was losing so much population, they were going to have to close prisons and get rid of state employees. They changed the law to take the level 6 felons back to the prison, right? So that's I didn't like either of those shifts. I don't think that should be the controlling function. I think, what is the punishment for a level 6 felony? What's the penalty range? And then we do it, and that's that. And those other considerations of whether we're going to have to close or open a prison should not play much of a role, but certainly they do. Yeah.
So I think we're at a place where we can start to wrap up a little bit. I certainly appreciate you coming on the show. I think, the idea anyway, and I want you to say some more about this kind of in conclusion, but is that retribution, the retributive theory, reflects the negative consequences of the actions that the criminal took back onto them from the victim. It reflects that negative consequence back to them. It sort of levels the playing field in terms of moral status, and in fact takes the perpetrator down a notch in terms of moral status. Is that fair to say? And then I guess in conclusion, what other things would you like to mention about the retributive theory of justice?
Yeah, so I think that's an excellent way to put it. I would add the status injury then in the wrongdoer is the best motivator that we have for that wrongdoer to change. It's the best incentive we have for the wrongdoer to change their behavior. And not only is it the most motivating thing, if they do and they suffer that punishment, it's a meaningful suffering that the rest of the community will recognize as being sufficient to regain status within the community, right? So I think it's a benefit not only to the victim, to the community, but it can be a benefit to the defendant. And that assumes that the penalty is proportionate to the crime. You got to get that right on the front end. And I believe that a more retributive model would probably result in shorter criminal sentences, particularly for drug offenses. A lot of times now our drug offenses are longer to give more time for rehabilitation. And then when a person fails at the rehabilitation, they end up doing more time in prison or jail than they would have with a more retributive model. So what I see when I survey the landscape on it is it's a more effective model. It satisfies a lot of goals, including goals on the defense side of shorter shorter sentences, particularly for drug crimes. So my advocacy on the issue is that we will always have a mixed philosophical underpinning for our criminal justice system that'll include rehabilitation and deterrence and retribution. But where we can, we should tilt toward retribution.
Yeah, I think those are certainly great points. And this is on a relatedly, I think you wrote, and I'll give you a chance to plug your Substack here in just a minute, but I think you wrote an article too about sort of the consideration of mercy as a judge, and that mercy is sort of de facto taking away the status of the victim, and that the judges shouldn't consider mercy as much in their, when they're considering the punishment of the criminal. So I'll link to that if you'd like me to as well. I don't remember. Was that an article?
I haven't published it, but you and I probably talked about it. Yeah. So,
okay. All right. Well,
but the concept is kings are allowed to grant mercy. Judges aren't. Judges are bound by the law. Right.
Okay.
Mercy is, here's what the law says you deserve, but I'm going to grant you mercy out of my own, because I'm such an upstanding moral agent. And democratically elected judges are not at liberty to do that. So that's a forthcoming article. Maybe we'll link to it.
Well, I'll link to that one in the future then, not with this show. All right. Well, thanks again, Judge Houchin, for coming on. I appreciate you being here. I hope that our listeners get something out of this. Like we said at the beginning of the show, I think these are important concepts to grapple with, because I think so often, like a lot of the topics that you hear about in the news, it's polarized, but there's very little substance. So I hope that people found this to be useful. And before we close up, though, I want to give you a chance. Would you plug your Substack and any other resources you'd like to mention?
Yeah, so the Substack is called Judex, Judex. Judex means to say the law. So it's a Latin phrase. So we advocate on Judex that you say the law, not make the law as the judge. And so write a lot about textualism, originalism, judicial restraint, separation of powers, retributive justice, these kinds of things. So judex.substack.com. Love anybody that wants to subscribe. Would be great. I'll, with your permission, publish this along with the link to your podcast. And I really appreciate it, Alex, having me on. It's a pleasure doing this. It's been all mine. And anytime, glad to have these conversations. So thank you.
Well, absolutely. Share it as much as you'd like, and we'll certainly plug your Judex Substack as well. So we'll leave it at that for now. And Judge Houchin, thanks again. Maybe we'll have you on again in the future. And thanks everybody for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed the show. And if you did enjoy the show, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to help spread the message of freedom. Tomorrow for Monday Gun Day, I'll be releasing an episode with a brief update on the ATF pistol brace final rule, followed by a discussion about a question that we get from a lot of people. Are you justified in using force to defend your pets? Until then, remember, you are the Forge of Freedom.